I'm Gordon. I'm Gordon MacLellan, and I work hello, and I work as an artist and a storyteller called Creeping Toad. And what I'd like to do this afternoon is probably talk for a sort of about 15, 18 minutes or so, and then open it up for questions. If you have any questions that come to mind while I'm talking, please just post them in the chat and we can pick them up later. And in the chat just now, I'm just going to post a couple of links to my work if you wanted to follow that up later. This is also me waffling because it means at this point I now have to work out how to share my screen, which, as we know, sometimes goes wrong. So here goes. Let's see, I need that, and then I need that, and I need that. Way, so we've got that far without anything going horribly wrong. And then let's go into, no, it's not going to play. Okay, we'll just, I hope everyone can see that all right. I was trying to get it into full screen and it's decided it's not going to do anything else. As I said, I'm a storyteller, and most of my work is around working with old stories. Sometimes we create new stories, but this session really starts with questions for you, our lovely conference delegates. And it's, do you listen to old stories? Or do you tell old stories? Or do you read fairy tales? Or did you read fairy tales once upon a time? And if you do you work with old versions of those old tales or modern tellings? Or if I asked you about fairy tales, would all your experience be based on sort of animated films from the last century or so? Because all that makes a difference, and it makes a difference to what we get out of a story, and it makes a huge difference to who we meet inside a story. I planned this talk when we were still hoping to be meeting in person in Reykjavik, and one of the outcomes of this talk that I was hoping for our delegates, who were our physical delegates, was that they could be encouraged to go and read some of those old stories of Iceland and the stories of trolls and the Huldra folk, the hidden people who fill Icelandic legends, and who are still recognized as an active part of the Icelandic landscape to this day. But instead, we're all digital, and so we're not going to be quite as Icelandic as we might have been. But also, I like pictures because I just feel it's more interesting than sitting looking at me for 20 minutes. So here's Creeping Toad. That's me. Let's jump on. So as I asked, do you tell stories? Do you listen to stories? For me, as a creative individual, my personal creativity is often rooted in an experience of locations, an experience of place. And again, for me, that's a direct, embodied, animistic sense of being in a place and with a place and becoming part of the spirit of that place. And I know that isn't for everyone. But if you're exploring places and exploring stories, sometimes a conversation with a character out of a story can prove an exciting challenge. When we tell old stories, fairy tales now, it's become quite fashionable to interpret them in the light of contemporary social issues. And that's very valid, and it can be very useful, and it can be a very rewarding process. It's a great way of unfolding the metaphors of our own lives and sort of exploring them through characters. And I don't want to get too sidetracked into that here. Or perhaps even into a debate about what stories might originally have been meant to mean or intended to mean. We're very good, or we seem to be very good at thinking that all ancient stories are there for deep and profound, or to hope. I'll start that sentence again. We're very good at thinking that old stories all have deep and profound meanings, and hold hidden truths. And I think sometimes we should also just bear in mind that many might simply have been told as exciting tales to liven up a long cold winter's night round a fire when there isn't much else to see or do. But tapping into those stories offers us as creative people all sorts of avenues. Oh, missed one. So within those stories, what intrigues me almost more than anything else are the characters that we meet and what an encounter with them might offer by way of inspiration. This is the Creativity Conference. We're trying to look at where creativity comes from, how we find and nurture our own inspiration. And often the more unexpected the avenue, the more rewarding that seems to be. So for the images that go with this little chat, I've picked up quite a lot of artwork from different people, and I went for the pictures that get me going, that I just think are wonderful. And artwork and artists you might like to follow up later. So there is, I think he's Swedish, he's certainly Scandinavian, an artist from the early 20th century, John Bauer here, who almost set the standard for what trolls should look like. So maybe, coming back to my theme of stories and characters, you might just think it'd be quite nice to have a conversation with some Scandinavian trolls. But if you looked at trolls, or witches, or wizards, we're very good at finding or at interpreting them as stereotypes. We're quite good at labeling characters with stereotypic roles. I mean, the classic one is the wicked stepmother who turns up in so many stories. But equally, well, we'll come back to witches in a minute or two. So we either seem to see characters as very shallow personalities. They're really there as ciphers, to move a story along. Or sometimes we see them as archetypes and think they're always going to be deep and profound. An archetype, if you like, is an idea that holds a wealth of subtle meaning. And again, that could be useful. But sometimes you forget, just put all that to one side, forget the stereotype, forget the archetype, and just meet the person. So to fuel your own imagination, to fuel your own inspiration, why not start with a story? An old story. An old story is probably best. And step back from interpreting it, step back from reading meanings into it, and just take it as a story and think about meeting someone from that story, and maybe separate hype from individual. It's a bit like knowing when you read a newspaper report about what someone's done, what some celebrity has done, that behind the celebrity, behind the story, there's still a person who breathes and eats and sleeps just the same as the rest of us. So when we read a story, it's quite nice to think about that side of the characters that we meet. And then maybe if we separate the subtleties of an archetype from contemporary stereotypes, we actually end up with a person. a person with their own goals and histories and perspectives, their own fears and delights. And I mean, maybe let's just take one out of my world. Think of a riverbank where the water runs deep and dark and fast. I'm Scottish. I come from Scotland, and here or there we have many stories about kelpies, and kelpies are wild and dangerous spirits of rivers that sometimes appear as dark horses or ponies, or sometimes as a handsome man, still horsey because they always have horses' hooves. But as man or as horse, kelpies often seduce people. You climb on the horse's back, or the man strokes you into a gentle oblivion. And horse or man, they'll then drag you down to the bottom of the river and drown you. And this, of course, has many interpretations. I mean, maybe kelpies are there as stories to teach us or children about the dangers of deep water. You know, it's sort of fairly straightforward teaching story. Or kelpies, maybe they represent this seduction and sexual exploitation and a warning about who you should and should not talk to. So as a general rule of thumb, only talk to strange men you meet on riverbanks if they don't have horses' hooves, is the main story that comes out of that, or this main teaching that comes out of that. But for me, kelpies are the voices of those deep pools that run down, the deep pools that run down off the moors and off the mountains, and the water is stained deep, dark with the peat. And for me, to put myself in the kelpies world is just to sit and listen and watch and see the world through a kelpie's eyes, not a world where it does all the horrible things our stories say, but the world of the river and the pool and the leaping salmon. And yes, there's a ruthlessness there. There's ruthless danger that water carries. So yes, it is dangerous. Yes, it's not to be trusted. But it's also always true to itself. And it is beautiful. And with kelpies, it's always worth just sitting by a riverbank and feeling the world, as I said, from a kelpie's point of view, from just seeing the dark water, feel the dark water, and enjoy it. And that sort of experience, certainly for me, is one of those things that sets me off, gives me things to write about and talk about. That's an example of stories that I know. You will have, I hope, your own stories. If not, go exploring, find some. So try reading stories for the characters in them. Not necessarily for the action the story describes, but for who those characters are, and look for the personality behind the news report, as it were. And remember, there's always at least two sides to any story. That's not necessarily a pitch for all monsters to be seen as misunderstood. Some monsters are just excellent as monsters. But also don't accept the libel that says Baba Yaga, who we've got here. Another artist to look up is Ivan Bilibin from early 20th century, I think. I mean, just because Baba Yaga keeps her iron teeth in a glass of engine oil at night, and just because her house runs off on its own to dance in the woods, and just because she might stuff you into her oven and roast you, doesn't actually mean she's a mean old witch. It might just mean she's a very interesting character. But equally, Baba Yaga isn't necessarily, as she tends to be interpreted now, a divine hag, a goddess who will challenge you and lead you to initiation. She might be. But she could also just be someone who loves gardening and who tends her house with care and has to chase it through the woods as it runs away, as you can see here, on chicken legs, and plays in the darkness of the woods. But maybe she is just that person who loves gardens, who looks after houses, who respects the bones that she collects. And until you stop and look at her and listen to her and not the story, you might never know. So try giving yourself the chance to have a conversation with someone unexpected. The characters we meet in fairy tales, check my watch, the characters we meet in fairy tales often hold a strong sense of place. In Kelpies, Baba comes from the deep woods of Eastern Europe. Iceland's Huldra folk are very varied and take many forms and are often very connected to aspects of the landscape. Like the Celtic fairy folk of Scotland and Ireland and Wales and Cornwall, their homes are often hillocks or outcrops. All of those places, all of those stories, all of those characters can give you a richness to play with. And I'm not suggesting you necessarily identify as animist here and go out looking to enter the fairy worlds. But as creative people, let yourself pause and have a conversation, imagined or real, with a character from a tale. I mean, possibly in the place where you might find that character in a story, you know, a riverbank, a wood, or sitting on a rock, sipping gin and looking out over the water, the sea in front of Reykjavik, which is where this picture comes from. In the deep ecology movement, isn't there something? Yeah. And the characters that we might meet, they're not good, they're not bad, they're just different. It's a good exercise in appreciating someone else's perspective. And that sense of looking at the world through something else's eyes is really valuable and rewarding. In the deep ecology movement, there's an immersive workshop called the Council of All Beings, which offers a more structured way of doing what I'm suggesting here. It does something similar. It aims to get participants to identify with and embody aspects of the natural world, and then they come together and share perspectives and conversations. It's very powerful. It moves people very deeply. It works best as a collective process. Whereas what I'm talking about here is usually much more personal, much more individual, and it is inviting you pretty much to take a wander through the woods of your own imagination. And in that process, in the snow-covered woods of Buxton, where I live in December, you might sit down and meet some cold person out of a cold story. And that meeting, that conversation could take any form. It might be words, might not be. It might be pictures scribbled on a piece of paper. It might be patterns drawn in the mud. It might be nothing but ideas and thoughts that drift through your head. It's more, give yourself the chance to stop and step out of our way of looking and use a character from a story to see the world from through another set of eyes or another set of senses. And there's always trolls somewhere. And I've just realized that this bit of text just sits in perfectly the wrong place. If you can see behind the somewhere, there is a wonderful troll's nose sticking up out the ground. And this is just a couple of miles from where I live. There's a wonderful set of rocky outcrops, and when you look at them, they're all faces. They're all faces just sunk into the earth. It's brilliant. And if you want pictures to get your head going, we've met Bilibin, we met Bauer earlier. Another artist to really look at for that sort of insane inspiration is Brian Froud. And a man he worked with a lot called Alan Lee, and Alan Lee designed lots of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit film imagery. But again,
so sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to give you a 2-minute warning.
Yeah, I'm finishing now. So
beautiful.
So that's me. I'm inviting you to go for a walk in the woods or wherever, and if you can, go for a walk with someone out of a story. And at that point, I'm going to stop and just say, if anyone has any questions or comments, it'd be lovely to hear from you. Thank you. Now everyone goes quiet.
Thank you, Doran.
Oh, hi. Thank you.
We met yesterday as well.
I thought I recognized you. Hi. Are you doing the conference? Have you gone to other sessions?
Yeah, I have, but it's a bit late where I am, so I'm not able to stay for very long.
Ah, yes.
So I wanted to ask you, when you've done sessions or when you work with, whether you work with children or you work with educators or other people, have there been fairy tales that you enjoyed? And has there been something that surprised you in the way people interacted or created something?
Right. Sort of two questions there. Have there been fairy tales that I enjoyed? Yes. I mean, it's very difficult to work with a story that you don't like, and I think that's it. But I have a very broad, I'm a very encompassing approach to most things, and I enjoy lots of things. So everything from, the very gentle, very beautiful stories to completely wild stories, and especially if you're working with children, it often seems to be the more horrible, the better. Or at least to start with. It's almost we have to go through let's tell a story where everyone dies horribly at the end. We almost need to go through that to then get to the gentle stories and the beautiful stories, and that's where all sorts of things unfold. And often that's where the unexpected comes. We had a lovely moment in one project where people were going off and coming back to us, having had a conversation with a tree. They all made friends with trees and one boy came back with it all very carefully written down what he wanted to say, and he read it out and nobody understood a word of it, and we all looked at him and he said, well, yes, I had a conversation with my tree, and so I wrote it all down in tree. And it was one of those, yes, that's it, we've got it, we've set someone off. And so things like that, they happen a lot, and it's lovely to see.